The Nigel Farage Show.
Good morning, everybody. It's Boris Johnson. He's all over the news day after day after day. Some of it, of course, is about his personal life and the announcement that he's split from his wife of 25 years, Marina, and they are getting a divorce. Excellent cartoon, I thought, in the Daily Telegraph by Matt yesterday. Two people coming out of number 10, one saying to the other, if Mrs. May was in charge of Boris's divorce, he'd end up staying married. I rather like that. So there's lots of personal stuff. There are photographs of Boris at the Oval yesterday, where England are on course to win this series 4-1 against India. And it's Boris sort of half asleep after lunch, and then pictures of Boris being shown on the screen from Sky, who were covering it, and he was getting a few boos and a bit of ribbing from the crowd. But today we are not going to talk about Boris's personal life. I don't think that's particularly relevant. There was indeed a Sky data poll done on this. Is Boris's divorce relevant to whether he should become the Prime Minister? 21% say yes, 72% say no. I would bet that almost everybody of that 21% would not be a Boris supporter anyway. I don't think that makes any difference in the modern world whatsoever, but if you disagree with me, please let me know. Now, it's politics I want to talk about, and it's his article. Boris has written today in the Mail on Sunday, and he's talking about Mrs. May's Chequers deal, and he says, it's a humiliation. We look like a 7-stone weakling being comically bent out of shape by a 500-pound gorilla. We have opened ourselves up to perpetual political blackmail. We have wrapped a suicide vest around the British Constitution and handed a detonator to Michel Barnier. So it's that suicide vest comment. And, of course, people are basically saying he's accusing Mrs. May of wrapping the country in a suicide vest. The question I want to debate this morning is, has he gone too far with these comments? Now, of course, we are used to Boris going quite a long way with comment. After all, he's a writer, he's a journalist, he's an author, and he's always, for all those long years he was working in Brussels and back in this country, he's always used flowery and colourful language. And, of course, it wasn't really very long ago when he was talking about the burqa, when he said, I could go further and say that it is absolutely ridiculous that people should choose to go around looking like letterboxes. So it's row after row after row with Boris. Is it just Boris being Boris? Or actually, has he gone too far, and has he damaged his chances? Well, before we came on air, we spoke to Harry Phibbs from Conservative Home, and we started off asking Harry what was his reaction to Boris's article in the Mail on Sunday that compares Mrs. May's Chequers deal to that of Great Britain wearing a suicide vest and Brussels having the detonator.
Obviously, we expect Boris to be colourful and outspoken in the language that he uses, but in the article itself, I didn't think there was anything unreasonable. It wasn't. He was talking about the government's policy rather than personalising it in terms of Theresa May. So I think there's a bit of synthetic outrage. You know, it's a bit as a bit there was in his previous article about the burqa, where people were saying he was wanting to ban the burqa, which actually wasn't the position that he advocated. But no, I think the language that he used about it being suicidal was reasonable, actually, that he was saying that we'd be in a position where the European Union would have the decision over the arrangements for Northern Ireland, and we wouldn't be able to, we wouldn't be in control of our own destiny. We wouldn't be in control of whether or not we were going to be forced back into the single market and the customs union and obeying EU rules, that they would be able to make the decision if they felt that trade wasn't frictionless enough with Northern Ireland. So I think it was a perfectly valid analogy for him to use.
So there we are, Harry Phibbs from Conservative Home talking about synthetic outrage over Boris's comments. Well, one person who is outraged is Sir Alan Duncan, who, interestingly, of course, was a junior minister when Boris was Foreign Secretary. They worked together. Alan Duncan tweeted overnight, for Boris to say that the PM's view is like that of a suicide bomber is too much. This marks one of the most disgusting moments in modern British politics. I'm sorry, but this is the political end of Boris. If it isn't now, I will make sure it is later. So we asked Harry Phibbs earlier, what did he make of Sir Alan Duncan's tweet?
Well, I thought that was extraordinary. First of all, I think he tweeted that last night, so I'm not sure that he'd actually read the article. So, that's in his defence in a way, that he might have been treating that out of ignorance. But it's an incredibly over-the-top, incredibly arrogant thing to say. Obviously, when the time comes to choose the next leader of the Conservative Party, the Conservative MPs and then the Conservative members will make a decision. It won't be for Sir Alan Duncan to issue some sort of personal veto over the choice that's made. So no, that was absurd, his comment.
Well, recent polling by Conservative Home in August, who Harry Phibbs works for, and LBC's exclusive poll last Monday shows Boris is the front runner to lead the Tories, and in fact by quite some margin. I asked Harry how he felt about that.
Since he resigned over the Chequers deal, I mean, he's been free really to put forward the case for Brexit as he would see it, as a genuine Brexit where we become a self-governing nation. And before, I think he was rather constrained and in a sort of rather unhappy position as Foreign Secretary, and now he's sort of come out all guns blazing and being very powerful advocate for his beliefs. And I think that those resonate with the Conservative Party membership, and I think more broadly.
And finally we asked, does he believe that Boris has the potential to become the Tory leader, and will, crucially, the Conservatives enable him to do this?
I think so. There is an important caveat that among the Conservative MPs there's quite a bit of jealousy. You mentioned Sir Alan Duncan, which was I think was over the top, but there's certainly quite a lot of MPs who've got reservations, and the rules are that it's the top two candidates in a Tory leadership election who go through to the party membership, but the MPs are able to choose who gets into the top two. So in a way that might be a bigger hurdle than him winning among the Tory membership if he gets through to the final stage. So that would be I think that would be the tricky hurdle for him to manage, but I would think he would be in with a pretty good chance.
So that was Harry Phibbs at Conservative Home, basically saying, look, what Boris said was perfectly reasonable, it's a question of context, and that actually he's really rather popular. Now, this LBC poll that was commissioned last Monday was a poll commissioned of leavers, regardless, of course, whether they were Tory voters, Labour voters, UKIP voters or non-voters. What that poll found was amongst leavers, 39% thought Boris was best placed to deliver a real Brexit, as opposed to 30% who felt the same for Theresa May. Look, my view is that Boris was very late to the Leave Party, really. I mean, for years and years and years, he'd made vaguely Eurosceptic comments, he'd written articles, but he'd always basically said we should stay part of it and try and reform it, and he came to the Leave campaign late. He was a very important voice in that referendum campaign, and my biggest criticism of him over the years is it's been often difficult to work out what he exactly believes in, what he exactly stands for. I think it's clear that he now does absolutely believe in Brexit, and I think, colourful language it may be, but actually, given this backstop arrangement, given Chequers, actually, we would be giving, if we signed up to this Chequers deal, we'd be giving Monsieur Barnier total power to regulate every aspect of our economic life without us even having a say. It would be a complete betrayal, not just of the Brexit vote, but actually of our national interest. I think he is wholly justified in saying these things. Others, like Sir Alan Duncan, think he's gone over the top, and this is the end of him. What do you think? That's what matters, really. Let's go to Chris in South Croydon. Good morning, Chris.
Oh, good morning, Nigel. Well, the problem as I see it is we've got a Prime Minister who approaches the Brexit issue like a vegetarian who's just been served up a plate of steak tartare. I mean, her heart isn't in it. But don't forget, even Barnier's rejected the Chequers deal. There's no chance of that going through.
Well...
and I'd like to see Boris use his undoubted elegance and gift for use of language. That's because he's got a proper degree instead of PPE, like all these other idiot politicians. In pointing out the real danger is a fudge. We could end up with something similar to Chequers, but as you say, leaving us virtually just the same.
Yeah. Actually, in some ways, Chris, what Mrs. May is trying to line us up for with Chequers is rather worse, I think, than where we are at the moment.
Yes.
I mean, actually, what we did see, Chris, towards the end of last week was some warmer words coming out of Barnier, coming out of Brussels about Chequers. To me, the mystery, Chris, is for nearly 20 years, leading EU figures have said to me, if you want to leave and have a simple free trade deal, that's fine with us. But the problem is Mrs May wants more than a simple free trade deal. She wants to keep us very closely tied to all sorts of regulatory agencies, etc. Chris, do you think do you think he's now the man to take control of this, or do you think these comments damage him?
No, I don't think they do, but I do think I'm worried about him as a certain moral emptiness in him, which other people have commented on. But on the other hand, that does not stop him from being an extremely effective Prime Minister.
Yeah, I mean, the big criticism of him from those that worked with him during his years of journalism is that, frankly, he would just make things up and believe he could get away with it.
Yes,
and there is some evidence of that, and perhaps that's what you're referring to. Mm-hmm. But he does have personality, I would put to you, Chris. And also, I think, when you're doing something, when you're going into a big change, which Brexit is, we need somebody with optimism, and I think Boris has that quality.
Oh yes, but also, of course, the other thing I'd like to comment on is how anybody can doubt Brexit after seeing how utterly repulsive the EU people are. Barnier, tell you what he reminds me of, is Gromyko, isn't he? He's like the foreign minister of Russia during the Cold War.
Yes, and actually...
I never imagined him smiling or laughing. Has he ever laughed at anything in his life?
No, I don't think so. Never in my company, Chris, in the coffee room, and I should be seeing him this week. No, he doesn't smile very much. And your reference to the Soviet Union, Brezhnev, of course, had this doctrine of limited sovereignty, which is rather what they're applying to Poland and Hungary and others today. Chris, very good call. Thank you. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC, and it's now 10:15. Well, the polls are open in Sweden. Their general election takes place today. Is it going to be another big leap forward for the populist revolt? We'll examine that in a few minutes. But back to Boris. His comments. He says that we've wrapped a suicide vest around the British Constitution and handed the detonator to Michel Barnier. Has he gone too far? Has he gone over the top? And as that's going on, the Sunday Times today reveal the Boris dirty dossier, produced by people, aides to Mrs May, in case of the event of a direct Boris leadership challenge. All sorts of details about Boris's life in journalism, Boris's personal life. The Dirty Tricks Department are ready for a Boris run. Isn't politics just such a charming business to be in? Well done, Boris. Well done on speaking plainly and saying as it is. This is leadership. Boris Johnson, the Gordon Ramsay of UK politics, says Chris. Because he did use the F word about big business, didn't he? So I guess that was quite Gordon Ramsay-ish in a way. Nigel, Boris's comment was flippant, but was used to highlight how much damage could unfold if Brexit isn't handled properly. I think all politicians should have the right to speak freely, their mind and opinions, and let us know exactly what they stand for. When I look at lots of Labour and Lib Dems, they seem to be too far engineered in their views and opinions and attitudes they express. Thanks for keeping it real, says Nigel. There we are, Boris. You got one or two fans out there, even if Sir Alan Duncan isn't one of them. I just remind everybody of what Alan Duncan put out last night. He said, for Boris to say that the PM's view is like that of a suicide bomber is too much. This marks one of the most disgusting moments in modern British politics. I'm sorry, but this is the political end of Boris Johnson. If it isn't now, I will make sure it is later. Sir Alan, I know you're a Remainer. I know you hate the whole Brexit thing, but isn't that really... I mean, to say that this is one of the most disgusting moments in modern British politics, he didn't even direct those comments directly at her personally. He made a general point about the Chequers deal. Alan Duncan, that is completely over the top in my view. Let's go to South London, to Streatham, and speak to Robbie. Good morning, Robbie.
Good morning, Nigel. How are you?
Yeah, I'm well. I'm back in the UK after a week in Oz, where actually their Conservative Party, which are called the Liberals, they are completely all over the shop with internecine warfare. They've been through 7 prime ministers in 11 years in Australia. But things aren't much better here. The difference is, Robbie, that Australia, the economy's doing well, the country's in great shape, and we're facing Brexit, a very, very big job that needs to be signed and sealed and acted on by the end of March. We're not in a great place, are we?
Well, no, we're not actually, and I haven't studied British Constitution, but it wasn't until Gina Miller challenged through judicial review the fact that this country is run on parliamentary decisions, and not many people in Britain, I think, have studied British Constitution. And I'm wondering whether Boris Johnson would be making the comments he made now, these inflammatory comments, were it not for the fact that the whole issue from the beginning was done back to front, and why all the MEPs, all the MPs, and that includes yourself, Nigel, didn't force David Cameron to go down the right route to have a debate in Parliament before the referendum was called.
Well,
and then when the referendum was...
Robbie, hang on. There was a debate in Parliament and a vote on Parliament as to whether the referendum should proceed, and it received an overwhelming majority. So
that was the referendum, but the thing is, there was no debate as to what the parliamentary decision would be, and whether they wanted to leave or remain. The whole point is that if it was a resounding remain from Parliament, the people should have been informed that Parliament have the right to veto any decision that the public make. But if not, then Parliament would go ahead with the public referendum.
Constitutionally, Robbie, everything you say is, of course, absolutely right. However, a national referendum is a time when we do not go through the usual route of representative democracy, and this is important. That £9 million document that Mr. Cameron sent to every one of our households said within it explicitly, the decision is yours and we will implement it. And surely that overrides our normal constitutional process, because this was a one-off situation.
Well, I mean, were there not objections from other members within Parliament that weren't in favour of that? Did they not criticise David Cameron saying that, and wasn't there no articles in the newspaper?
Well, I think, to be honest, Robbie, if on the verge of a national referendum on a matter of this importance, MPs had stood up and said, "We don't care what you vote; it'll be our say anyway," they wouldn't dare to say that, would they? Because there would have been a huge public reaction against them. So no, voices on that were very, very muted indeed. Robbie, I get your point constitutionally, but what about morally? Isn't it morally the case that government and Parliament should carry out the express will of the people?
I think it should be, but on the basis of the fact that they go down the right route and carry out the right debates, and make it quite plain to the people. And then following that, Nigel, when it came to a decision before that referendum was even taken, the European Union members should have been approached to get a definitive answer to what it was going to cost us to leave the European Union, so that people would have known in advance what they were voting for, what deal they were voting for.
Well, I'm not sure it really costs us anything to leave the European Union, Robbie. It's just a question of what we're prepared to give. But let's say, Robbie, I mean, we've got these negotiations. We're all over the place. We don't really know exactly where Theresa May's taking us. She appears to want us to be half in and half out. Would Boris make a better job of it?
Personally, if Boris Johnson were the last MP on earth, leader, I would not vote for him. He's a bully boy. He's non-diplomatic. He's not very good at diplomacy at all. He can upset a lot of people, and moreover, he does not listen to the little people. He's very dismissive.
But Robbie,
what he says goes.
But Robbie, he did manage to, win elections to be Mayor of London in a city that is pretty much a Labour city these days. He does have electoral appeal, Robbie.
When he did, what I'm amazed about is why he had the bikes made in Canada when Britain was going through a period of austerity, when there were plenty of British engineers over here to make the bikes.
There are all sorts of criticisms anyone can have of any Mayor of London at any time, but he does have personality, he does attract votes. I mean, isn't he, compared to all the really rather boring, dull people, doesn't he bring a little bit of fun to it, Robbie?
Well, he might well bring a bit of fun, but if he's leading us down the wrong road, I don't think it's the right person to fill the position, to be quite honest with you.
OK, so you feel, Robbie, strongly that the Constitution should be upheld and that ultimately Parliament's got to sort Brexit out, not the people's decision on June 23rd, 2016.
Well, no. I basically think that the people should have a great say in it. I think, well, let's put it this way. We're in a bit of a cleft stick here, really, because of the way it's been handled. The Parliament does have to get on with it. whoever does it, and I don't relish Theresa May's, and I don't support Theresa May, incidentally, in any great way, but I wouldn't relish any MP doing that job, because they're not going to win with the people.
No,
None of them are going to win with the people.
It's not easy, Robbie. No one said it was. Thank you very much indeed for your call, and Robbie, they're not a great fan of Boris. I wonder whether these repeated comments that are portrayed as being outrageous, I wonder whether they are perhaps damaging slightly his support in the country. I don't know. I mean, essentially the other evening we had a phone in about Boris. There wasn't quite as much enthusiasm for Boris as I thought there might be. Edward from Sunderland says, interesting that there was nowhere near this much outrage when Remain campaigners were using similarly shocking language to describe the prospect of leaving the EU. Edward, they promised us everything short of plagues of black locusts descending upon our islands. Nigel, Sir Alan who? Never heard of him. Another political non-entity, says Laura from Shenfield and Essex. Sir Alan is very, very important. It must be addressed as Sir Alan at all times. On Twitter, I get the real suicide is leaving the EU, deal or no deal. Not for those of us, matey, that want to govern our own country. We actually view it as being a wonderful, invigorating prospect. Ross is calling from Bromley. Good morning, Ross.
Good morning, Nigel. Well, before I start, can I just submit to you that perhaps Sir Alan was somewhat inebriated when he made those comments on Twitter?
What a terrible thing to say. Because you do know, Ross, that you can, in the House of Commons, you can pretty much call another member whatever you like. You can call them philanderers and wrong-uns, but if you accuse another member of being drunk, that is against the rules. There was the famous time when the late Alan Clark, and he was dressed in black tie, he was at a dinner, and he was dragged back to the Commons to give a ministerial statement, having not expected it, and he could basically hardly speak, and he was absolutely cut. And Claire Shaw got up and said he was drunk, and she had to apologise. So, Ross, you must not say Sir Alan was inebriated. You may say maybe he was tired and emotional.
Yes, of course. Well, maybe that's better. Well, maybe it would go along with the whole idea of adding to liveliness to our public discourse if we had more inebriated politicians like Sir Alan, and also if we had Boris jump into the fray. Look, I don't agree with Brexit, but it's been voted on now. It's passed, so maybe we should just have Boris have a go at it.
Okay, do you think, Ross, whatever Boris's flaws, and clearly they're many, but equally he's got some great talents too, do you think, Ross, and you're not a Brexiteer, but we're going through this process, do you think he would make a better job of it and make the country feel a bit happier if he was in charge and not Mrs. May?
Yeah, I do. Well, definitely Theresa May, and that's the thing is you really only have these two options, it seems. And yeah, I do. I think he would. Would make it better, yeah. Yeah, well, I have to say, Ross, I agree with that, absolutely. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC, and it's now 10:30. And Sweden goes to the polls today. Sweden, a country that had very settled politics for a long period of time, a country in which, with relatively high taxes and quite a big state, many talked about the Swedish model, perhaps the one country in which a form of socialism has seemed to be a very great success. But that settled politics has radically changed over the course of the last few years. To help us through this, to explain where we are with Swedish politics and what might happen today is, and I'm very bad at these pronunciations, but it's Tova Svenoni, I think is right. Is that right, Tova?
It was very good, actually.
Oh, well, that was more by luck than judgment, believe me. Head of National News at Swedish Radio Echo. Good morning. Tova, please explain, because we've never really looked much at Sweden politically, because it's been so settled over the years. Just explain to begin with.
It's been so stable, it's been boring, right?
Well, in many ways boring, but I used to do business and go to Stockholm regularly, and I remember thinking, this is one of the most contented countries on earth. Everything seemed to work very well, and things have changed. Explain to the listeners who the main parties are today in Swedish politics.
Right, we have 8 parties in Parliament now, and they form 2 sides traditionally, one left side and one right side, and that's the traditional way that Swedish politics have been divided. So after every election, traditionally, there has been you have to look at which side is the biggest and which side can form a majority in the Parliament, and that side forms the government. So it's been quite easy. But then the Sweden Democrats showed up, and they have grown over the last years. and now they are a big third factor in Swedish politics, and that has changed the game plan totally in the Swedish parliament and made it more difficult to govern because it's harder to form a majority in parliament.
Yeah, but
and the two sides.
They sit in the European Parliament now, and I think they first got into the Swedish Parliament in 2010, if I'm right.
Yeah, that's right.
And it would be fair to say, would it not, completely objectively, that if you go back to the 1980s, you know, their roots as a political party genuinely were on the extreme right.
Yeah, that's right.
And they've tried to rebrand under their leader Jimmy Åkesson. You know, they would say that they've left their far right past behind them. They've reformed. They're very tough on immigration, and pro rata, Sweden's had more migrants go to it than any other European country. Have they succeeded in the eyes of Swedish media and elsewhere? Have they managed to detoxify themselves from their history?
I think partly, yes, and especially when it comes to the voters, because they are growing. And in the last election, we had 13% of the voters, and now it looks like they can be the second biggest party in Sweden, or the third. But it's the real possibility that they might be the second biggest party.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at polls saying they're on 20% of the vote, and yet tough on immigration, and Jimmy Åkesson promising that if he gets the chance, a referendum for Swedes on Sweden's EU membership.
Yes. So they are tough on immigration and also very negative to the EU.
Yeah, okay.
So that's important issues for them.
And has this new input of them, and as you say, they're lying second in the polls at the moment, who's to say what will happen on the day, does it mean that there's a bigger interest in Swedish politics? Does this mean turnout goes up?
It might, but it's hard to tell because the turnout is usually quite good in Sweden. So it's hard to tell if the turnout will be better than normal, but it might be.
And if they were...
And it's also that the Sweden Democrats may have voters that normally wouldn't vote. We don't know that.
Equally, they may have voters who are too shy to tell pollsters, because we had this with Brexit, we saw it with Trump. They're almost scared to admit that they're going to vote for parties like this. If they did, and I'm not saying they will, but if they did become the biggest party in Sweden today, would the other parties consider forming a coalition with them, or will they be left out in the cold?
The thing is, no one wants to talk to them. So even if they would be the biggest party, that's not likely, but we don't know. I mean, everything can happen.
Yes.
I don't think it's possible right now for them to be in a government because no one wants to cooperate with them. On the other hand, it's hard for the other parties to, if they would to be the biggest party, it's hard for the other parties not to talk to them because they have a big base of people.
And one thing I've noticed, I mean, I do follow Swedish politics. One thing I've noticed is that the other parties, to some extent, have tried to take some of the Swedish Democrats' rhetoric, because there is now talk, as they're not, in the other parties, of reducing the numbers coming into Sweden.
Yes, almost all parties are now talking about immigration in a different way than they did 4 years ago, or a very different way that they did 8 years ago. So they have affected Swedish politics.
So is populism now sweeping Sweden?
I wouldn't say that, but you could.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Tova. That was great. Well, that gives you a bit of a rundown on where we are with what was very boring politics in Sweden. The Swedish Democrats lying second in the polls at the moment, tough on immigration, anti-EU, and already, you know, as we saw there, the other parties now beginning to change their rhetoric. Sweden, over the course of the last few years, you know, a country of 10 million people, and about 600,000 of those have been migrants that have come within the last decade. Pro rata, they've taken more than any other country. And you'll have seen in the last few weeks, you know, the scenes of cars burning in city centres, huge increases in murder rates, huge increases in sexual violence. That's not to say that all of that is being done by migrants coming in, a majority of it is, but a general breakdown of law and order in Sweden cities, a place in which that would have been literally unthinkable 20 years ago. Back to Boris. Has he gone too far? Is talking about us being put into a national suicide vest and hand him a detonator to Monsieur Barnier, is it over the top? Does he start to lose credibility? Or actually, is it about time someone just told it as it is and put a direct challenge to Mrs May? Harry is a new caller from Bournemouth. Good morning, Harry.
Good morning to you, Nigel.
So, what do you make of Boris's words?
I think he's absolutely correct, and I completely and utterly support what he is saying. If we go down this route that Mrs May wants us to go down, we may as well have just completely and utterly changed taken away all of our vetoes and all of our power that we currently have. We're going to end up in a worse position than what we were before we all voted. And I think it's absolutely correct that Boris is standing up for what the people said. And the vote was in or out, and that is what we need, not to become, as a lot of people are calling it, a vassal state.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, Harry. Of course I agree with that. But let me ask you about Boris. Does it worry you that he continually gets into a row, whether it's talking about, people wearing burqas looking like letterboxes, whether it's the use of this term suicide vest, whether it's his continually, it would appear, colourful private life? Does any of this stuff worry you about Boris?
No, not at all. I think it's very refreshing that we've got a politician and a potential leader that actually is willing to speak his mind rather than pussyfoot around everything. With regards to his love life, well, good, that's a personal thing, and it doesn't affect him becoming, possibly becoming the Prime Minister in my eyes. I actually think that he would be a great man as Prime Minister.
And he's not very, he's not very diplomatic, Harry, is he?
Well, nor was Winston Churchill, and he became probably the best Prime Minister this country's ever had.
Is Boris the British Trump?
Yes.
OK. All right, Harry, that was very interesting. Thank you. And actually, the more you start to put this together, the more he does look a bit like the British Trump, doesn't he? Interesting. Peter is calling from Wimbledon. Peter, good morning to you.
Good morning to you, Nigel. Before I get to Boris, one thing I'd like to say to you and to your loyal followers, that out of all people who voted in a referendum, Brexit referendum, only people on the Remain side knew what they were voting for.
No, they didn't.
To remain as they are.
No. Peter, stop. The European Union does not stay where it is. It is a process aiming at never-ending integration. And since, and I'm saying this, Peter, because I'm going to be sitting next to, on Wednesday morning this week, sitting next to, in Strasbourg, the European Commission, and Mr Juncker will give his State of the Union address. Last year he told us that the European army would be completed by 2025. That wasn't put to the electorate during the referendum. So the idea that Remain is just a still static status quo is simply not true.
Well, it is true because we have the right of veto for a start. And the other thing is about the army, what you go so upset about is your pal across the pond, Mr. Trump, has already said that NATO is obsolete, and European nations have to take care of their own defences themselves. And that's why European Union is rightly so talking about creating its own military. And the thing is that what is the difference between NATO and EU forces? We only have a difference is that there's no US in it.
This is about the truth. This is about the truth. Look, I debated this in 2014 with Nick Clegg. I said one of the reasons not to be part of the EU is it's developing a European army. I don't think we should be a part of it. Clegg described that as a dangerous fantasy. And on your point about veto, we have no vetoes over changes to legislation that affect our business life in this country. The European Union, I repeat, is a process aiming towards never-ending integration, aiming towards a unitary state. So I reject totally this idea that Remain was a static state. But Peter, let's move on. Let's move on.
Because let's move on. Because there's such a variety of issues, and you guys, yourself, including Boris Johnson, you lied about so many things.
Peter, I've had 50 years of lies, 50 years of being told it's just about trade. Don't worry your stupid little heads. Let me ask you, Peter, quickly. I don't know, you've called before and we don't agree on this, and that's fine. That's what LBC's for in many ways. But in your view, forgetting where you stand on Brexit, as a person, do you think Boris's comments are over the top, or do you think actually they're appropriate?
this is why I called you, because I'm really annoyed, because people like you are laughing at it and you're making jokes and stuff. What you don't realise, that the comments like Boris Johnson made, they are deeply, deeply upsetting to the family and the loved ones who lost their loved ones in a bombing, suicide bombings, which happened in this country. And when you make comparison of our Prime Minister to someone wearing a suicide vest, you clearly have lost your moral compass completely.
All right.
And if you think that that's my opinion. That's
no, Peter, listen, I've got to move on. You've given your opinion clearly, and Peter thinks it's wholly inappropriate to say that. It's an insult to the loved ones of people who have been killed by suicide bombers. It's not an unreasonable point. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show. It is now 10:46. It's wall-to-wall Boris. It's Boris falling asleep watching the cricket and being booed by the crowd. It's Boris Johnson's personal life. It's the dirty dossier on Boris that Number 10 has produced if he makes a run, a real direct public run against Mrs May. But of course, above all, it's his article in the Mail on Sunday where he says we have opened ourselves to perpetual political blackmail. We have wrapped a suicide vest around the British Constitution and handed him a detonator to Michel Barnier. Are those comments over the top, or is it just kind of what you expect from Boris and accepting the point that anybody who has lost somebody as a result of a suicide bombing might feel offended by those comments? In general terms, I would say the thing I like about Boris, there are things I don't like, the thing I like about Boris is he makes people smile. There's a little bit of optimism. When he talks about Brexit, he talks about the sunlit uplands in the years to come that we'll have as an independent nation. It's all a lot better than the perpetual misery we get from Mrs May. That's my view. Daniel is a new caller from Marylebone. Good morning, Daniel.
Hey, good morning, Nigel. How are you?
Good morning. I'm well. So, has Boris got this right, or has he got it wrong?
For someone as well-read and well-spoken as Boris, he's used a poor choice of words, but let's not detract from the point. And why we're even having this phone call on your show today, I'm surprised. I'd expect this on maybe James May's show. But the point is, he called a spade with a poor choice of words. And for someone like Peter to take offence, rather than actually focus on the issues here of capitulation and us bending over to Europe, we're all getting lost in the fuzz and the spin of it all.
So is Daniel your point that what Boris is saying is correct in terms of direction of travel, but a distraction in terms of the words he's used?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I do understand that. But this is Boris, Daniel, isn't it? And you're right. He's highly educated, and you can sit down and talk about the classics with him. And he's written some in his book on Churchill. I'd recommend anybody to read. It's a terrific read.
But I think look at Peter's point as a Remainer. He's taken this as a personal insult almost of what Boris has used as language. He's not focused on debate and educated, informed discussion around Brexit. He only wants to get touchy-feely and oversensitive. And this is the problem the Remain side has. They can't sit down and ever produce any tangible debate. They can get wound up, they can get upset, but they can't retort on Brexit.
What do you think? What do you think Boris should have said? I mean, should Boris have said that Mrs May's deal is a betrayal of the Brexit vote and would lead to us being disadvantaged by future EU decisions?
He has come out on the record and said that multiple times.
Yes.
Simply by resigning over Chequers, he's put his job on hold as a result of that. So I don't think he needs to state that anymore.
So does he? So is he, Daniel? I mean, come on. We are dealing here with an intelligent person. Is he changing the rhetoric? Is he upping it because he wants to keep in the front pages?
I think he's seen around the world, people are now appreciating being spoken to as human beings, not as electoral voters, but as human beings per se. And that using real language that's used by the man in the pub, the man on the street, the woman on the street, the man, the lady in the pub, is actually now appreciated. And it's as a result of your work and other people's work over the years that we are tired of being spoken to, and everything is window dressed and decorated for our benefit. Let's call a spade now, and it's refreshing, as one caller said earlier, to hear Boris talk like a real human being.
Okay. Okay.
Figure it how it is, not sugarcoat it, but say it is what it is, and we need to.
And if we have this conversation, Daniel, if you and I have this conversation in 2 or 3 months' time on this show, do you think by then he could be Prime Minister?
I very much hope he will be Prime Minister. I would prefer Jacob Rees-Mogg to be Prime Minister in truth, because I think he would be he's a more educated, slightly more refined version of Boris, even.
There's a point about Jacob. There's a point about Jacob. I mean, Richard from Salford says this to me on text: the sooner Johnson is Prime Minister, the better. As much as I'd like to see Jacob Rees-Mogg at the helm, I think it might be a bit too early for him, but his time will come. Would you agree with that?
I think he was born ready. He was been ready since the age of 7 years of age. And if you go back and you watch videos on him talking as a young kid, he was destined for this position in life. And I look forward to seeing him there one day, please God.
Well, in many ways, so do I. Daniel, I thank you very much indeed for your call. Interesting that we didn't get this outrage during the campaign when Remainers told us shocking things would happen to us. Yes, I know. David is in Wimbledon. David, good morning.
Good morning, Nigel. How are you?
I am well. Now, Boris, is he over the top? Is he damaging himself? Well, keep making the headlines saying things that are outrageous, or is it synthetic outrage we're hearing from Sir Alan Duncan and others?
Well, I think we only just have to look 3,500 miles across the Atlantic and the election of Donald Trump.
Yep.
And I think that Donald Trump was elected because he spoke directly to the people in language that they understand. And they don't, and never sugarcoated it. And I think the problem is that there are too many people who just cannot accept, the use of language. I think Boris knew exactly what the words that he was using.
Yeah.
And I think that, it was a metaphor, and I think it was perhaps unfortunate for some people who were affected. I'm an ex-military guy. My regiment served in Afghanistan, Iraq. I have former colleagues of mine, that unfortunately lost limbs as a result of that action. But I don't think that they would condemn Boris for what he has said. I think the metaphor was entirely appropriate.
Yeah, and I get your point, David, about Trump, etc. I think we've had enough. We're bored with these careerist politicians who never say boo to a goose, who are politically correct beyond belief. We want real people, flaws and all, that stand up and say stuff and mean it, don't we?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, actually, if you look at politics in general, I think the dissatisfaction of the British people with our politicians is that the politicians are ranked the lowest, have the lowest regard and respect amongst the British people, below that of a car salesman. I think it's down to something
or an estate agent, or...
Yeah, at 14%. And I think it's because people think that they talk, they're double standards. They say one thing, and they do.
I think, David, and I think it's self-interest, isn't it? We think they're in it for themselves, they're in it for the career, and they'll say anything to get elected. Isn't that what it's really all about?
Well, I think that's a shame, and I think that is why we're seeing politics turned on its head in other countries. What we're seeing in sort of Sweden, what we've seen in Italy, what we've seen in the United States, around the world, is that people want to be spoken to and told things how they are.
Yeah.
You are always going to cause some offence. Like Peter in Wimbledon, who's a scratch record when it comes around to Brexit. I've heard him many times.
He's a regular caller.
Thinking that us Remainers were stupid and we didn't know what we voted for.
I know. I must admit, and also his argument, David, that Remain was a status quo when it's not, it's a process. David, I've got to let you go there. 2 last quick comments on this. Scott says on Facebook, the only thing Boris can be trusted with is his own self-interest. Bob says, if Boris becomes PM, we really would be the laughing stock of the world. Well, as ever, anything to do with Boris gives us a huge amount of opinion on both sides. He knew what he was writing here. I don't think it's offensive. I think Sir Alan and others are using this as an excuse. It is, as ever, faux outrage.